Good morning, everybody. On behalf, one more time, that's a great way to start out a conference, isn't it? To immediately stumble over my own tongue. On behalf of myself and the rest of the Connections Online team, Merle Robinson and Brant Guillory, Zach Grant, and the rest of the Armchair Dragoons, I would like to welcome you to the Connections Online Showcase 2022. Connections Online is a member of the Connections family of wargame conferences. The Connections conferences aim to advance and preserve the art, science, and application of wargaming by bringing together practitioners and other interested parties from every segment of the wargaming community to share best practices and advance the field. Together, the Connections conferences around the world are building the wargaming community of practice and working to improve the use of wargaming as a tool for research, analysis, education, and policy. We hope to advance those goals today by showcasing 8 games with an in-depth examination of the objectives, designs, mechanics, execution, and the lessons learned from the preparation and conduct of the games. Each of the 7 sessions has been allocated 2 hours to allow plenty of time for questions. If you are watching live, you may submit those questions using the YouTube chat function. And now let's get started. Our first speaker is Nick Bradbeer, who it makes a lot of sense that he's here because I met him at a Connections conference. So Nick, over to you.
Thank you very much, Chris. Hello, everybody. I'm Nick Bradbeer. I currently teach at University College London. I teach naval architecture. So my focus is less on how to use combat forces in combat and more on how to create those forces. I'm teaching people to design warships and design submarines. So in the ways, ends, and means breakdown of warfare, I'm very much focused on the means side. How do we provide the hardware that navies need to fight? So I'm here to talk today about a balanced fleet, which is the name we're moving to from what used to be called a simple UCL Wargame, ASUW. The name change is in large part because ASUW was an increasingly inaccurate name. It was no longer simple. We started out simple and it didn't last simple very long. And it's not really tied to UCL and it's not really one game anymore. So we have a new name, which is a bit of a curse of wargame development. I need to start off with the standard disclaimers. I'm not here speaking on behalf of either of my employers. I'm giving my own views. I need to say that while we are designing this game was developed for the purposes of teaching people about military applications, it contains absolutely no classified or official data. All of the data that this game sits on has been drawn from unclassified and open sources. And finally, I need to say that ABF is currently undergoing a very significant rewrite, including having the name change from ASUW to ABF. So the material available to show you is not really in its final form. I thought it was more useful to show the developmental material, which is an improvement from previous iterations of it. But we're still looking at essentially draft material when we get to running through a playthrough. So Dunnigan had a really good point about wargame design, which is that a good wargame should have the players making the same sort of decisions that the field commander present in the actual battle should be making. So they should be presented with the similar sorts of information and they should be worrying about the same things that that commander would be worrying about. I think that's a very insightful comment, but it doesn't give me what I need. I need a wargame which focuses not on the decisions of how the commander employs their forces on the day, but on how the designer of those forces made the decision when producing them. I'm teaching warship designers, not warship operators. And so I need something which didn't seem to exist. I've talked a lot before in different conferences about the process by which we came to develop this wargame, and so I'm not really going to talk about that today. We'll focus less on the why and dive more into the what. The name A Balanced Fleet is drawn from British Maritime Doctrine, Joint Doctrine Publication 010. This is actually an out-of-date version now. It's been replaced by British Maritime Power, but British Maritime Doctrine defines 3 components of warfighting. There's the conceptual, the moral, and the physical component. The physical component is the means to fight. And one of the components of the means to fight is defined in doctrine as a balanced fleet. This is the people and equipment, that's platforms, weapons, sensors, and so on, which deliver the military effects that we want either at sea or from the sea. And that's what I'm teaching people to do. Within fiscal constraints, there's a balance to be struck between investments in quality and quantity. And deciding where that balance lies is very hard. It's dependent on the solutions, the problems that you're trying to solve and the risks you're trying to bear. But solving that problem gives you a balanced fleet. And that's what this whole game is about. I am trying to teach students to understand how good they should make their warships, because obviously a better warship is better, a more capable warship is better, but a more capable warship also will be a more expensive warship, so you can't afford as many of them. And understanding how to strike that balance between cost and capability is a fundamental lesson of naval architecture. And it's a very difficult one to teach by conventional methods. A key part of the ship design process is what we call the cost capability trade-off, where students will look at a number of different options for possible combinations of capability they could have in their ship. And for each of those options, they will rate them for cost and for capability. They'll plot them on a graph something like this, where we have cost on the x-axis, capability on the y-axis. They'll plot a Pareto frontier, the red line, and then they will look for a solution which offers good value for money. So we've got all the cheap wins, significant increases in capability, which don't cost very much money, and we're not going to take all of the diminishing returns, where it costs lots of money to give a small improvement in capability. So these graphs are very useful, but to provide them, we need to understand how much the different options cost, and we need to understand the capability that each of the options offers. Cost is fairly easy. I say easy because everyone knows accurately costing military equipment is actually a significant challenge. But for our purposes, within the design exercise, we can algorithmically model cost. And it won't be exactly right because we're not modeling effects of shipyards and details of demographics. But we have baselined that model, and it predicts reasonably good numbers. So certainly for a comparative exercise like we're doing here, our costing model is probably good enough. So that's not a problem we need to solve. But capability, understanding the capability that a particular option set offers, is very, very difficult. We need to express that numerically. And turning a set of measurable measures of performance into more intangible measures of effectiveness, so that the problem at the heart of operations analysis, that's actually quite a tough problem. Unfortunately, we don't have time in the ship design exercise and submarine design exercise for doing proper OA studies, because those are quite short exercises. They take about 3 months, and the students have to design a ship in that time. So in the cost capability trade-off phase, we largely force students to rely on engineering judgment. So assessing the capability relative to other option capabilities and assigning it a metric. The problem that we have there is our students don't have any experience of doing this usually. So asking people to rely on engineering judgment when they don't have the experience to support that judgment is a very tough thing to ask them to do. And so the point of this game is to help them make those decisions. Playing the game can help them gain some understanding, which can allow them to support those engineering judgments. And if they want to have a more thorough comparison between two different option types, we can use the game to game the effectiveness of those different options out. They might have a frigate and they can afford the budget to either put a particular type of new weapon system on it, or they could put increased aviation facilities on it, or they could put better defenses on it. Now, all of those options would improve your military capability, but they would improve them in ways which it's very difficult to directly compare. Is a harder punch more useful than the ability to find targets more effectively? Is that more useful than the ability to protect yourself more? Building an OA model to do that is quite tricky. But playing those situations out in a war game can help students to understand in a holistic mission scale way what the different benefits that those three things offer are. Obviously, they are only exploring them in the context of a single scenario at that point, but that's still quite useful. So we need a game which is actually less about how the commander employs their forces on the day and more about the raw capability of the ship. So I want a game that focuses on the engineering and actually minimizes the effect of tactical decision-making as far as possible, which is quite an unusual set of requirements for a wargame. So we want to reflect, as far as possible, the important engineering decisions which students make when they're designing the ship. As naval architects, that means layout is critically important. I care about where equipment is located in the ship because concentration, duplication, and separation of equipment can radically affect the vulnerability of a ship. I care about the subdivision of the ship, how its smoke-tight damage control zone boundaries are arranged, how its watertight integrity is arranged, and therefore how many internal compartments it can allow flooded before it will sink. Hitting the ship in different locations can knock out different equipments. And you can damage ships by hitting them. You can degrade their capability, but ultimately you're most likely to sink ships or render them actually unable to function by either setting fires that overwhelm the damage control capability, so fires across the ship or smoke penetrating throughout the ship, or by flooding. Widespread flooding can lead ships to sink or capsize. Widespread fire can lead to ships being mission killed and unable to function as warfighting units anymore. So we need to model all of those things, and most war games don't. We also need to model information asymmetry because that's such a central aspect of all modern naval warfare. Knowing where the enemy is and getting a strong first punch in is usually decisive. And so we need to reflect that because we need to reward choosing systems which improve your information control. If I'm asking students to assess the relative utility of putting scary hypersonic missiles on a ship versus putting additional reconnaissance drones on a ship, if we don't model that information asymmetry, the answer is always going to be more missiles or better missiles. But that's not always the right answer, as we can see in reality. And ammunition matters. It's really important. A lot of modern war games will just allow ships to keep shooting anti-ship missiles as long as they want. The game I was running yesterday, which I shan't mention, has modern anti-ship modern warships firing at each other, and if they roll a double on 2d6, then they have low ammunition now. And if they roll a double again, then they have no ammunition, which means on average, you'd expect them to fire about 12 salvos before they run low on ammunition. Realistically, most modern warships only have between 8 and 16 anti-ship missiles. So generally speaking, they have 1 or 2 good salvos in them. So the ability to generate enough salvo weight to penetrate defenses and still have enough missiles left to generate perhaps 1 more salvo is critically important. And we need to track ammunition usage if we want any sort of realistic result, especially since choosing how much ammunition the ship should carry is such a vital part of the capability selection. So these are the things which we need the game to do. And these are the things which naval war games typically don't do, or don't do all of. That's led us to a game which has these characteristics. Detailed ship sheets. Ships are not just represented by a counter with some numbers on it. Even when we get to operational scale games where we might have a dozen ships on a side, we can't just represent a ship with a counter with stats on it. We have to have a separate page, usually an A4 sheet for each ship, to record damage, ammunition, and a bunch of other things on it. We use some method of controlling asymmetric information. We can use either double blinding. That's if we're feeling like we really want to do this properly, we will have 2 maps, 1 for each side, and then we'll have a team of umpires which maintain a picture of the truth and reconcile detections. So each team can only see what their units can see at any given time. There's a faster way, which if we are if we're running teaching games where we're not focused so much on the detail of the result, and we want to let several groups play at once rather than having half the class be umpires to control one single game, we sometimes use Columbia blocks as an alternative. Those are the Stratego-like blocks where the unit's information is on one side and you can stand the block up so the owning player can see it, but the other player can only see that there is a block there. And many of the blocks will be dummies, so by searching the area, you get some of the benefits of double blinding. It's not quite as good. There is information flow that wouldn't really exist. For example, if red team says to blue team, I can see that Columbia block, I can illuminate that hex, show me whether that block's a dummy or not, then blue knows that one of the units close to that is a real unit rather than a dummy, for example. But on the other side, it's a lot faster. So depending on our needs, we will either use double blinding or Columbia blocks. The important thing is we don't have an open table. There's always some kind of concealment of information. In terms of scale, we usually use 10 mile-hexes, 10 nautical miles, so you can see about one hex with the naked eye, and 1 hour long turns. So that means that ships capable of doing about 30 knots can travel 3 hexes in a turn. That's a kind of scale of movement. Missiles can shoot out to anywhere between 6 and 15 hexes, usually. And fundamentally, this game is more about the ship design, the process that went into designing it, than about how it's used. So the rules are quite light on the kind of tactical decisions which you would expect the commander to be making. And that gives it quite a different feel to lots of war games. I suspect a lot of wargamers wouldn't find this a very satisfying game to play if they just received some ship sheets in the box and you got to bust out those ship sheets and fight them, because the point isn't really how you fight them. The point is in how you designed the ships to come up with those ship sheets. So this is a game which bolts on to the end of a 3-month design process, or in some cases onto a truncated, perhaps day-long design exercise. But you have to remember that the point of this is the design work, not the operational decision-making or tactical decision-making. I said the ship sheets were reasonably complicated, and at the moment, they look like this. These have evolved quite a lot from how they started, and they are not finalized yet. The information that goes on the ship sheets is more or less correct now. There's definitely some graphic design pass work that still needs to be done to make the ship sheet easier to read and make it more attractive. But you can see we have a lot of information presented on the page, and we need one of these for every ship in the game, because this is a record sheet as well as a stat sheet. So if we work our way through the sheet slowly, first up, well, the obvious thing is we have a silhouette of the ship. So this is viewed from the side, broken down into sections. Those sections correspond to the primary transverse bulkheads. So if you have the structure inside a ship comprises 2 types, really. There's primary structure, which is watertight decks, and transverse watertight bulkheads. Those are structures which can resist flooding. And there are also structures which can, to some extent, resist blast propagation because they're airtight or watertight. And most modern warships will have something like 10 or 12 internal transverse bulkheads, dividing the ship up into sections. And they usually have one main watertight deck, the damage control deck. So we divide the ship, in this case, into 11 transverse sections, and then high and low, above and below the damage control deck. You can see there are various items of equipment, so weapon systems, gun, VLS, CWIS, radar, ops room, engine rooms. Exactly where those go are important decisions that players have made, well, design students have made. We can also see at the top of the ship, we divided into 3 damage control zones. So those zone boundaries are smoke boundaries. Each damage control zone will have a damage control section base, will have its own ventilation arrangements, probably its own power generation. And so those are important features for fighting damage and firefighting on the ship. As long as we have an intact damage control zone, we have some ability to undertake damage control and continue fighting the ship. If we have fire and smoke in all of the damage control zones, that's a very difficult situation to recover from. And so if we have fire in all of the damage control zones, we consider the ship to be mission killed. This rewards students putting lots of damage control zones in and sensibly dividing them up. That's quite an expensive thing to do, particularly in terms of the crew required and the systems required to support it. And that's kind of one of the points of the game. We want to reward costly decisions that the students have made during the design. On the left-hand side, you can see the damage effects box. This tells us what happens if the ship gets hit by either a large warhead or a small warhead. In the event of a hit, we'll roll a d6 to determine whether the hit goes high, above the damage control deck, low, below the damage control deck, or at or below the waterline. And as you can see, there's a pattern of red dots, which represent how many compartments get damaged by blast and fire, and then blue dots underneath, which represent how many compartments get flooded. You can see there's a line of flood boxes underneath the ship's silhouette. Compartments get flooded when we take damage, and this ship has a flooding tolerance of 3. So it can tolerate 3 of those compartments being flooded. If more than 3 get flooded, the ship will lose stability, capsize, or founder. And that's something which is supported by students doing a damage stability analysis. As long as they comply with DEFSTAN 02108, then the ship is okay. But that will tell me how many compartments they can lose before they stop complying with the DEFSTAN. Flooding is the other way that you can lose a ship. So our 2 kill criteria are fire in all of the damage control zones is a mission kill, or exceeding our flooding tolerance means that we lose the ship due to loss of stability or loss of buoyancy. Looking below that, on the left-hand side, we have speed and sensors tables. So for this ship, it's pretty simple. If the ship is intact, then it has a speed of 3. It can move 3 hexes in an hour. If it's damaged, so that's if it's taken any damage at all, then, if it's taken any engine damage at all, it drops to speed 1. And if it's lost all of its engines, then it has no speed at all. Below the speed, the movement table, we have the detection table. The detection model we use here is very simple. A ship is either on MCON, not radiating from its active emitters, or it's on active, where it's got radars turned on. That determines which column of the table it uses. And this simply gives a range in hexes at which we would detect ships, aircraft, and missiles. As you go active, those ranges tend to increase. But if you go active, you give your position away. To the right of those, we have aviation mission boxes. So this ship has a helicopter and Scan Eagle UAVs on board. So it has 2 types of aviation and therefore 2 sets of aviation mission boxes. Each of these boxes represents a mission that you can have your aviation do. So you put a counter in the AEW box or the recce box to have your aircraft fly that mission. AEW just stays near the ship and extends your sensor coverage, whether you're passive or active. Recce actively flies out a certain distance and then pops up and looks around. So that will reveal hexes near a point. Strike allows you to fly out and then actually attack something. And ASW allows you to attempt to find and sink submarines. In this case, neither of the aircraft on board can do ASW missions, and the Scan Eagles can't do strike missions. So those boxes are marked not applicable. To the right of those, we have the ship's weapon system details. We have offensive missiles and then the defensive systems. In this case, the Bulldog has a substantial VLS with 24 large strike-length cells and is equipped with 2 different types of missile. This is a pretty shiny ship with some nominal future Royal Navy technology. There is the FCASM, which is the Future Cruise and Anti-Ship Missile, which is a joint Anglo-French project, currently fairly conceptual, but a hypersonic missile based on the MBDA Perseus concept. So this is long-ranged. It's very, very fast. The missile has a purple border, which signifies that it's hypersonic. And we can see it can target ships. It's got a range of 15 hexes. It has a large warhead. So it uses the large warhead column on the damage effects table. It can fly over land, and it does not have any intermediate waypoints. It goes straight towards the target. We also have the MDCN land attack cruise missile, which is similar, and we'll gloss over that. The defensive system table is one of the most complicated bits on the ship sheet. This gives us a series of columns, in this case 4, for defending against different types of attacker. The blue column for aircraft, the green column for subsonic missiles, the orange column for supersonic missiles, and the purple column for hypersonic missiles. Each column gives us a number of opportunities to intercept one of those things coming in. So if one of those things is coming for us, we start at the top of the column, we work our way down, and we have a series of opportunities to try and shoot the thing down. We'll go through that in considerably more detail in a minute when we get to a run through. That's the ship sheet, and that's the most complicated part of the game, really. This is a small example of a map that we might use. It's not very pretty. In future, we will have more picturesque maps generated by GIS software, but all you need is a hex grid, keyed for land and sea. For some games, you care about shallow water and deep water, particularly if we're involving submarines or mines, but that's as much detail as we need. We might want to mark on cities or critical objective locations. In this case, you have got a city there, that black square on the right-hand side. And we've marked on shipping lanes as well, the red dotted lines. Shipping lanes are important because often in these games we want to have merchant traffic, because a confusing surface picture is a part of lots of modern warfare. So we will often have neutral merchant traffic in the area, which on radar just looks like a contact, and so requires positive visual identification to tell whether it's a warship or a merchant ship. That complicates the players' lives in a way which is important. That's part of that information asymmetry. So to show how the game works, there's no better way than running through. And I'm going to focus on the bit of the game which is its focus, which is deep water ship-to-ship missile engagements. So we have about the simplest scenario possible. We have a red force incursion into an area, a pair of nominal frigate designs, sword class and hatchet class, which they are not real designs, but they are inspired by real designs. So these are not dissimilar to, I think, a Steroguchi class and a Admiral Gregorevich, I think. Well, you can draw your own conclusions. And the area is defended by a single Blue Force heavy frigate, a Bulldog class, which is not a Type 26, but has some similarities to a potential future shape that a Type 26 might one day be. We're going to use a really small map this time. Normally the map would be maybe 25 by 25 hexes, but we don't need that. So we'll just use a small one that I can show you stuff in more detail on the screen. We have 2 maps because we're running this game double blind. So Blue 4 has a map, and Blue 4 can see their own ship, but they can't see the red ships. The Red Force has a map, and they can see their own ships, but they can't see any blue ships. The Umpire team have a map which maintains the truth. So that will have all the units on it. And the Umpire team will spend a significant amount of their effort during the game reconciling detections and working out who can see what at any given time. So Red Force has these 2 ships. Sword is the larger one. This is armed with Yakhont supersonic anti-ship missiles, the Russian export missile. It has 8 of them. There's a VLS in Zone 7 marked ASM for anti-ship missiles. 8 orange boxes there signify 8 supersonic anti-ship missiles available. It has a VLS up forward, marked VLS, for short-range surface-to-air missiles. These have a range of 10 nautical miles, which is pretty short, and there are 32 missiles in the bin. However, these missiles will always be fired in pairs, so we don't need to record single missiles being fired, and each box with an S in it for short-range represents a pair of those short-range missiles being fired. She has a pair of Sea-Wiz for point defense, and then back aft has aviation in the form of 1 helicopter, 1 Helix type helicopter, which is capable of airborne early warning and recce, but those are the only missions it can handle. The other red ship is a Hatchet light frigate, which is actually armed with longer range air defenses than the Sword was. She has a VLS with 8 medium range SAMs and 16 short-range SAMs. So that's, again, really 16 medium and 32 short-range SAMs, but we're firing them in pairs. So we will cross off one box to signify 2 missiles. And that's baked into both the ammunition count and the probabilities of intercept. She-2 is armed with anti-ship missiles, has 8 Uran SSN-25 switchblades mounted amidships. These are shorter range than a Yakont, and they're subsonic rather than supersonic. So it's easier to shoot them down. It's harder for them to penetrate defenses, but if they hit, they'll do about the same amount of damage. Blue Force, represented by the Bulldog heavy frigate. So this has the hypersonic anti-ship missiles, and it has 16 of them. It has, I say medium range, they're shortish range SAMs. Out to about 20 miles, has 48 of those in 2 VLSs, split midships and forward. Again, fired in pairs, so we have a total of 24 boxes to tick off. And then it has substantial aviation facilities. So we have a Wildcat helicopter and 3 Scan Eagle UAVs. Scan Eagles are really only good for spotting, but spotting is incredibly useful. So the first turn, both sides decide where they're going to move, and the umpires will then move the ships on their truth map to represent that, and then we'll reconcile detections. Now, given that we have detection ranges measured in 2 to 3 hexes, and each ship can move 3 hexes on a turn, it is possible that 2 ships could run past each other, going from undetected to right on each other's face. In the event that that happens, because we have umpires, we can step through the movement gradually. We usually don't need to, but the option exists. So the ships are moving. Bulldog is moving up along the shipping lane, and the 2 red ships, perhaps inadvisably, split around this island to ensure they have good radar coverage. Well, I say radar coverage. All of these ships are still on MCON, so no one is radiating, and that's why they can't see each other. The umpires now then place detection range circles around each ship. They're all on MCON. All of these ships detect another ship at 2 hexes with MCON, so we draw a 2 hex radius around them. The umpires check if any of the ships are in each other's radius and establish that none of them are. So nobody can see, nobody detects anyone else. Aviation then becomes really important. So the Hatchet decides to employ its Helix helicopter in the reconnaissance role. It puts its helicopter token on the recce box, and the recce box says fly to any hex within 10 hexes and reveal enemies within 3 hexes of that point. So in order to not be too aggressive, because if you lose your helicopter, that's a significant blow, the red player decides not to send it too far forward and just puts the helicopter in 0306. So that's 1 hex away from the Hatchet itself, scouting ahead. So the helo flies to 0306 and reveals everything within 3 hexes. That reveals the Bulldog. So the red force now know where the blue ship is, and the blue ship appears on their map. Blue on MCON only detects aircraft at 2 hexes, and the red helicopter is 3 hexes away. So blue does not detect that helicopter. So red now has an information advantage. If blue was active, blue would detect aircraft at 5 hexes. So absolutely would have detected the helicopter. But also if blue was active, it would have detected the red ship at 3 hexes, and it would have appeared on the red map because it had gone active and started giving away its position. So with the information advantage and the advantage of getting the first punch in, red decides to shoot. Red's different forces can have different grades of data link, which allow them to coordinate missiles or not. The most advanced form of data link allow time on target strikes by forces located in quite disparate locations. And so forces can combine their missiles into a single salvo, even if they're firing from different locations. More rudimentary forms of data link allow you to do that, but only with the same type of missile or weapon, the same type of missile if you're in the same hex as other firing units. And then at the very bottom of the grade, you can't combine salvos from different ships at all. The 2 red ships are armed with different types of missile here, one subsonic, one supersonic, and their data link doesn't allow them to do coordinated salvos that well with different grades of missile, so they will attack separately. Hatchet has Uran ASMs. They have a range of 6 hexes. The Bulldog is 4 hexes away, so they're in range. Deciding that the Bulldog has pretty reasonable air defenses, the correct number to fire is probably all of them. Hatchet fires all 8 of its Urans. So the Hatchet player now crosses off 8 Uran ammo boxes, those green boxes in the center, and has now fired its heavy anti-ship punch. The blue player, the ship is on MCON, so it detects missile targets at a range of 1 hex. So the referees inform the blue player they have detected anti-ship missiles 1 hex away. They can tell them the direction that they're coming in from, and then we move on to blue attempting to defend against them. And for that, we need the SAM table. The first thing that happens is if it wants to use surface-to-air missiles, blue has to light up its radars. So using any defensive weapons means that the ship goes active. That means that we put an active counter next to it on the map to mark that. It will automatically appear on everybody's map, and now it can switch, or for subsequent detections, it can switch to using its active detection ranges rather than its MCON detection ranges. This is the defensive table from the Bulldog sheet. It's a subsonic missile incoming. It had a green border and green ammunition boxes. So we use the subsonic column. Against subsonic targets, we can get a lot of opportunities to intercept with SAMs. At 2 hexes, we get an opportunity. At 1 hex, we get 2 opportunities. At 0 hexes, we get 2 more. At self, we get 2 more. The difference between 0 hexes and self is 0 hexes is within 10 miles of you, but potentially going for a different ship. You might be escorting a high-value unit or a merchantman. Self is the last couple of miles. So at that point, if the missile is going for another ship, you don't get those opportunities. But if the missile is going for you, you do get those self-defense opportunities. So after we've had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 opportunities to shoot down with the missiles, if any have got through that, our decoys will try and seduce them away from hitting us. It says here 7+, 9+. Those are the numbers you have to roll if you do have decoys, 7+. And if you don't have decoys because they've been knocked out or for some other reason, 9+. That represents the chance of the missile just missing rather than your decoys necessarily doing anything about it. And finally, if anything get through the decoys, your CWIS might be able to take them down for you. The missile boxes all say 4S 3+ in them. What that code means is you can engage 4 targets, so that's 4. So that's also the number of dice you roll and the number of ammunition boxes you cross off. Every target that you engage costs you 1 box of S ammunition, which is what the S is there, and lets you roll 1 dice. If that dice, a D10, scores a 3 or better, then that missile has hit. So that's what this table means. Bulldog does not get to make the intercept opportunity at 2 hexes because we were on MCON. We only detected the strike at 1 hex, so we've already missed that opportunity. So we go to the first 1 hex opportunity. We roll 4 dice. We expend 4 S rounds of ammunition. We roll 4d10. We get 2, 2, 4, and 7. We needed 3 pluses. So 2 of those cams have hit. So of the 8 incoming missiles, there are 6 left, and we've expended 4 of our 24 boxes of S ammunition. Again, at 1 hex, we roll 4 dice, expend 4 S ammunition. We roll 1, 2, 8, and 9. We're not rolling well today. And I did legitimately roll all of these. So the dice it's come out quite nicely, but that was a legitimate probability distribution. So we've shot down 2 more of the Urans, half of them are left, and we're down to 16 cam. Now at 0 hexes, we roll 4 again, rolling 1, 1, 6, and 9, again with the terrible rolls. 2 Urans are left, and we have 12 cams left. The second intercept opportunity in 0 hexes, we can only roll 2 dice now because there are only 2 targets left. We roll 2 dice, we get a 5 and an 8. They're both hits because they're both 3 or better. So we've shot down all of the Urans. We've expended 14 of our 24 cam boxes. So the attack is defeated. Nothing hits the ship. The map now looks like this. Blue's map, blue has gone active. So we have an active counter next to the Bulldog, and the new detection range circles mean we can detect the helicopter at 3 hexes, but we still haven't detected the red ships. Similarly, on the red 4 map, where we can see all of our own units, we can see the Bulldog partly because it's in a detection circle, but also partly because it's gone active. So after that attack, the Bulldog is fine, but it's on about half its ammunition load for its CAM short-range missiles. They know something is out there, and they know roughly which direction it probably came from because they saw the direction that the missiles came in for their last hex. So Bulldog, again, decides to use its own aerial recce and launches a pair of Scan Eagles. So we put Scan Eagle counters in the aviation box and choose their location on the map. So Blue Force chooses these 2 hexes, 0506 and 0207, and drawing the Scan Eagles detection circles on there, which aren't as large as a ship because they're only UAVs with electro optics, it detects the hatchet. The helo has sufficient range, or sorry, the hatchet has sufficient range to detect the Scan Eagles as well. It picks up 1 at 2 hexes, 1 at 3 hexes, and it can do something about that. It's detected aircraft popping up within its detection range, but also within its weapon range. If we look at the aircraft column on the defenses chart, Hatchet has SAMs which can engage things at 2 hexes. So it decides to. Firing SAMs will set it active, so it will appear on the map, but it's pretty sure it's been detected anyway. So it can only engage the closer one, the further Scan Eagle's 3 hexes away. It could engage up to 4 targets, but there's only 1 target. So it engages 1 target, crosses off a single M medium range missile from its VLS, rolls a dice, rolls a 6, which is better than the 4 that it needs. So it shoots down the Scan Eagle. But in the process, Hatchet has gone active. So now it's on the map and it can be attacked. So that's what Blue 4's map looks like now. No Scan Eagle, but Hatchet has gone active. So Bulldog elects to fire 8 missiles back at Hatchet, but it has 8 hypersonic missiles available, not the supersonics that the Hatchet was firing. So it crosses off 8 of its FCASMs. Hatchet is active, so it will detect missile targets at 3 hexes. If we look at the detection box, the missile row and MCON column. It can see them at 3 hexes. It can't engage at 3 hexes. But if we look at the purple column on the defense grid, we can see that our first interception opportunity is at 2 hexes. We can also see that we have very many fewer interception opportunities against hypersonics. Whereas a subsonic, we would get to shoot 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 times, shoot at them 6 times. The hypersonic, we get to shoot at them twice. This is a function of the hypersonic missiles going very fast. So by the time your SAM has yonked out to reach them, they've closed a lot of the distance between where they were and you. So that reflects how many interception opportunities you get. They're also a much tougher target because they're moving much faster. And that's reflected in the required dice roll to hit. Hatchet shooting at a subsonic target hits on a 2+. There's a very accurate SAMs. Shooting at a hypersonic target, it only hits on a 4+, which is still pretty good, actually, but it's significantly less good. So we get to engage once at 2 hexes, once at self-defense range, and then we're reliant on decoys. Well, we do have a CWIS. The hypersonics are just way too fast for CWIS to do anything useful. They're flying at something like 2 to 3 times the speed of the bullets that come out of the CWIS, and by the time CWIS engages at 1 mile, even if the CWIS hits, the missile is still going to crash into the ship. So CWIS is sort of an irrelevance against this kind of weapon. So that first opportunity at 2 hexes, the Hatchet rolls 4 dice, needs 4s or better. Needs 4s or better. Rolls a 4, 6, 8, and 8. We cross off 4 medium missiles. At self, note that we're now firing a different kind of missile. Instead of 4M 4+, we're now 4S 4+. So we're shooting short range, not medium range missiles. At self range, cross off 4 S's, and we roll a 3, 7, 9, and 10. So one of those misses. We've got 1 ASM still coming in. Then the decoys kick in. Decoys can attempt to seduce as many missiles as there are remaining. They're not limited by ammunition or salvo size. There's only one missile. It rolls a dice. They need to roll a 7+ to seduce it. They roll a 5. The missile ignores the decoys. And the missile is too fast for Seawiz, so there's no Seawiz engagement opportunity. So one missile has hit the ship. The next thing we have to work out is where it's hit the ship. We roll 2d6 for longitudinal location, and looking at the numbers on top of the ship, you can see they go from 3 to 12. If we roll a double 1, we've missed. It's quite a small ship. For even smaller ships, there are increasing numbers that you can roll and just miss. We roll 2d6 for location and we get 6. Obviously, 2d6 will tend to give us a bell curve, and that means ships' missiles will tend to strike in the middle of the ship, which is a reasonable approximation of how anti-ship missile seekers work. They tend to hit around the radar centroid. Some more modern anti-ship missiles work in a different way, might be more sophisticated. They might aim for the bridge. They might aim for discontinuities in the superstructure. And we can represent that in the game. But for old style missiles, 2d6 and a bell curve is pretty good. So we've hit location 6. Then we roll 1d6 to see whether we're high or low and consult the damage effects chart. We rolled a 3, which means we hit low. So consulting the damage effect chart, for a large warhead, you can see that we do 1 section of damage high and 3 sections of damage low, and we flood 1 compartment. So we mark the ship with these fire counters. And this tends to be how damage propagates through a ship. It hits 6 low, it blew the deck out up into 6 high, and so blast propagated up into there. It blew the bulkheads into 5 low and 7 low, and so fire will propagate into there. And it's blown out plating underwater in section 6. So we've got limited flooding, widespread fire below, and some fire above. Fire in those sections knocks out systems. So Hatchet no longer has any functioning engine rooms. Hatchet also no longer has any functioning auxiliary spaces. Auxiliaries are what supply your electrical power, your chilled water, and ship services in general. Without auxiliaries and without a path, these red lines on the ship sheet connecting equipment to an intact auxiliary room, the equipment can't function because it's not receiving electrical power, it's not receiving chill, and other things it needs. So Hatchet is still floating. She hasn't got fires in all of her damage control zones. So her forward damage control zone is still a base from which they can fight the fire. She hasn't exceeded her flooding tolerance of 2, so she's not sinking. But without any engines, she can't move. And without any electrical power and chilled water, she can't operate her weapon systems. So she's functionally dead in the water. So this is what the map looks like now. So that was Hatchet's salvo. Sword now will also make her own attack. She couldn't combine. You can see how it would have been desirable if we could have combined those attacks into one, because after Blue had shot a bunch of things down, maybe there would have been a bunch more missiles and few opportunities left to defend them. But we can't, so we have to fire 2 separate salvos. But at least these missiles are scarier. Now she has Yakons, which are supersonic, whereas Urans were subsonic. Sword knows where Bulldog is because Bulldog has gone active. Bulldog doesn't know where Sword is. So we fire 8 Yakons. We cross off 8 Yakons. And again, we return to Bulldog's defenses table. Bulldog is active, so she'll detect these missiles at 3 hexes, which is good. She won't miss opportunities to shoot. And checking the yellow column, you can see we can engage once at 2 hexes, once at 1 hex, once at no hexes, and then we're into decoys. So these are fast. There are fewer opportunities to shoot them down. You can also see they are harder targets than the Urans were. We needed a 3+ to hit the Urans. We need a 5+ to hit these supersonics. And if someone threw a hypersonic at us, we need a 6+. These numbers just represent the relative difference in capability between the different incoming missiles and the defensive SAM systems. So first opportunity at 2 hexes. The blue player rolls 2, 6, 8, and 9. We needed a 5+, so 3 of those hit. That kills 3 of the 8 Yakon, leaving 5. Unfortunately, we only had 10 S boxes left on Bulldog, and we've just fired 4 of them. So we only have 6 intercept chances left. At 1 hex, we can engage 4 targets again. We roll a 1, 4, 6, and 7. We needed a 5+, so that shoots down 2 more Yakons. There are 3 left coming in. And now we only have 2 cam boxes left. At 0 hexes, the third intercept opportunity, we'd be allowed to roll 4 dice, but we only have 2 boxes of ammunition. So we only roll 2 dice, crossing off our last 2 ammunition boxes. We roll a 2 and a 6 for 1 hit. That leaves 2 Yakons left, and we're out of cam. The next layer is the decoys. We need to roll 7+ to seduce the decoys. We roll a 2 and an 8. So one of them succeeds, but 1 Yakon breaks through. Where does that Yakon hit? We roll 2d6 for longitudinal position, and we roll a 7. We roll 1d6 for vertical position, and we roll a 1. That means we've hit section 7 on the waterline. Looking at the damage effects chart, we set 1 fire high, 3 fires low, and 3 sections flooded. Now, looking at what this does to Bulldog, we've still got an engine room, so she can still move. But she's taken enginal flooding damage, so she's now moving at her damaged speed. So her top speed is 1 hex per turn, down from 3. However, she does retain an auxiliary room up in section 9 low, below the ops room. She has 1 remaining auxiliary space. That means equipment that is still connected to that auxiliary space will still work. However, section 7 high is on fire. So the auxiliary supply routes passing through 7 high are broken. She's taken 3 sections of flooding, so she will sink if she takes any more, because she has a flooding tolerance of 3. She has fires only in the central damage control zone, so she still has 2 intact damage control zones. And she's badly hurt, but she's not dead in the water. Her radar, her ops room, and her forward VLS are still intact, although empty of defensive missiles. Her forward gun is still intact. Her decoys are still intact. Her aft CWIS and aft engine room can't operate because they aren't connected right now to an auxiliary room. But while damage control parties can't repair broken equipment during the game, they can repair system runs. So they can run cables and flexible pipes through spaces to restore system runs that are through damaged compartments. So at the end of the turn, Bulldog does exactly that. She uses a damage control party to restore the system runs through 7 high, which reconnects the engine, the CWIS, and the aviation facilities to the auxiliaries. So Bulldog is now a hurt ship and completely out of defensive missiles, but she is able to continue functioning. On the next turn, well, the hatchet stays dead in the water. Sword moves very slowly northeast, the direction the missiles came from. Bulldog moves slowly northeast, the direction the missiles came from. The sword runs south at full speed and is now active. Sword doesn't have any anti-ship missiles remaining, so it's probably running in to use guns. Bulldog does have anti-ship missiles remaining because she had 16 FC ASMs to start with. So detecting the sword, she decides to throw her remaining anti-ship missiles at the sword. Sword is active. She had an active marker. She elected to go active. So she'll detect them at a range of 3 hexes, but her defensive systems are quite short range. She won't get the chance to engage them until 1 hex. And you can see we get to engage at 1 hex and then self-defense range. So at 1 hex, we have a defense code of 4S6+. So there's at least 4 things incoming. We roll 4 dice, cross off 4 S's, roll 7, 8, 10, and 10. So despite needing 6+, all of our defensive SAMs hit, and we shoot down all 4, or shoot down all the 4 of the 8 that we aimed at. The second intercept opportunity at self range, again, we have a 4S6+. So we roll 4 dice, and this time get 1, 3, 5, and 9. Our luck has abandoned us, and we only hit with 1. So there are 3 incoming FC ASMs left. We have 8 short-range missiles left. Those 3 incoming missiles have to run the gauntlet of our decoys. Each missile, well, the decoys roll a dice for each missile, rolling 2, 4, and 8. They needed a 7 or better. So the decoys seduce 1 of the missiles, and 2 of them will hit the ship. We use 2d6 for location, and then 1d6 for height. Roll a 5 and a 6, then an 8 and a 5. And they will hit in 5 high and 8 high. Looking at the damage effects for high shots, we create 3 fires high, 1 fire low down, and no flooding. And that destroys almost all of the sword's equipment among the central section of the ship. But more importantly, if we look at the damage control zones, each of the 3 damage control zones, signified by the green lines at the top of the ship sheet, now have some fire in them. So sword has a fire in every damage control zone, and that makes her a mission kill. So that resolves the missile engagement. The sword is on fire and unable to do anything. The hatchet is dead in the water with too much damage to her engine rooms. Bulldog is quite badly damaged. She can't move at full speed, and she's out of SAMs, but she is operable. So Blue Force has won the day in this case. So that's an example of the sort of central mechanic that tends to be pivotal in the games. A game of ABF tends to involve engagements on 1 turn, usually. Forces will maneuver, attempt to scout and try and find each other. And then when one force does get a good understanding of where the other force is, they tend to try and deliver a devastating blow to knock out the core of that force. So while the missile engagements are quite time-consuming to run through, that tends to be a thing you do once per game, maybe twice per game. So those numbers, where did they all come from? It's the architecture of the game it operates on these 3 layers. It's important that the engineering capabilities of the ship are well represented. So we have the wargame at the top is well, I say playable, you've just seen how long a missile engagement takes to play through. It's a relatively simple model, even if there are lots of steps that we have to go through. We want that model to be a balance between playability, so that we can get through it reasonably quickly, but also enough detail that the players can see why the numbers are the way they are. So I could abstract all of the missile defense opportunities against a raid into a single dice roll with a lookup table. And I haven't done that. We've deliberately chosen to keep this a process of rolling for each salvo, partly because that helps students understand exactly what's going on, but also because it's quite good for creating an emotional state in students. I've talked quite a lot about this in the past, but it seems to be a very efficient way of getting people to remember things if you make them feel things at the same time. And if we've created a game which puts students into the headspace of the captain aboard this ship, and they're having to watch a salvo of missiles come towards them, firing their SAMs and whittling that salvo down and hoping they whittle it down far enough that it doesn't hit them, that creates the kind of engagement which means students remember those moments, and they remember the importance of having sufficient SAMs or having sufficient engagement opportunities in a way which telling them in a lecture or having a single lookup table where they roll a dice and they get hit or they don't doesn't really achieve. So the engagement model is the way it is for several reasons, really, not just one. But to produce a model which is even though that isn't the most simple model we could use, a model which is simple enough to be playable, but reflects the detail of technical differences between different systems, we have this 3-layer architecture. The wargame itself is the output. That sits on a number of operations analysis models. Exactly what those models are will vary depending on what implementation of the game we're using, but the missile engagements, which we were just walking through, are based on what I've snappily call the missile engagement model, which is a big spreadsheet which just does a time domain, discrete event simulator, tracking the positions of the SAMs and incoming raid, and applying detection limits and kill assessment time and so on. So we have a reasonably detailed model which tells us how many intercept opportunities we're going to be getting, and an indication of the probability of success in each of those. There's a separate OA model for sonar detection range, and so on. Those models are modular. If we wanted to, we can plug different models in and out, and as long as they feed out the same kind of inputs into the wargame, from the wargame player's point of view, it's seamless. And then in turn, those OA models require a database. So my missile engagement model needs to know, well, how fast does a harpoon fly? How fast does an SA-20 fly? What's the probability of an SA-20 hitting a harpoon? And I need data to feed into that model from somewhere. The philosophy of this architecture is the database is completely separate from the OA model and the wargames, because that means you can change it out. The database which we use is completely unclassified. It's been assembled from a combination of Wikipedia and Harpoon, the Admiralty Trilogy game Harpoon, because that's a reasonably comprehensive database which looks reasonable, and reasonable is as good as I need. In the event that you wanted to use this game for something more official, you wanted to actually do some OA, if you had a classified database or a commercially sensitive database, it would be very straightforward to just swap out my unclassified open source database for a more closed set of data. And that would just feed seamlessly into the OA models, and that would feed in turn seamlessly into the wargame. So the point of this architecture is it gives us versatility. We can use the same game development process in different environments. This is an example of one of those OA models. This is the missile engagement model. And as you can see, it's a giant Excel spreadsheet, because who among us engineers does not love a giant Excel spreadsheet? And it's a lot of numbers, but basically it's just a discrete event simulator. On the right-hand side, you can see, well, the left-hand side is inputs. The picture on the right-hand side, we can see columns for each SAM engagement. So that salvo will be launched when the raid is 25.78 kilometers away. It will fly out, it will impact at 26 seconds after launch. And then there will be a kill assessment time, which for this ship is 5 seconds. And then we can see at 31 seconds, 5 seconds later, the second salvo will be launched. So it's tracking the positions in one-dimensional space of the raid, of the outgoing SAMs. It's working out how many intercept opportunities we're going to get. It's doing a PK calculation based, again, just on unclassified Harpoon data, and it's working out the probability of hit. This lets students explore quite a lot of options quite fast. We can change the type of the SAM that we're shooting out. We can change the type of the radar on our ship. We can change how high the radar is up on our ship. We can change the capability of the combat system of our ship. And we can change our engagement philosophy. So most of the missiles here are fired on a shoot, shoot, look philosophy. So against each target that's incoming, we'll shoot 2 missiles at it, and then we'll wait and see whether they hit before we shoot again. One of my student teams last year was tasked to defend against hypersonic missiles being fired at them. And they used this tool, crunched a bunch of numbers, and they concluded that the most efficient way they could do that was, instead of mounting a really big, capable, heavy SAM system that had a long range and had a really relatively high one-shot PK against hypersonics, they instead just put a lot of short-range SAMs on here and embraced a shoot, 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 shoot look philosophy. So instead of firing 2 missiles against each incoming target, they would shoot 4. Because the missile that they were using was data link controlled, and the data link bandwidth was available to have lots of missiles in the air at once, and they didn't have to defend against a very large number of hypersonics, that actually came out with pretty good PK for the engagement. It just meant that they had to carry a lot of defensive missiles, but because those defensive missiles were quite small, that was a good trade-off. So This model and the game allows students to explore those dissimilar trade-off questions, like, do I want to put this defensive system on, or is it better than upgrading my SAM system to upgrade my sensors so that I'll detect the threat further out, that kind of thing. So there are several slightly different ways we've employed this game. Mostly we've used it in what we call tactical scale. So that's, as I said, 10 nautical mile hexes, 1 hour turns. The map usually looks something like this. This is from a ship design exercise on the master's course a few years ago, before the pandemic reached us. And you can see the students sitting around the table controlling one side's forces. You can see in the background, there's a different cell of players. I can't remember if they were Red Force or perhaps controlling merchant traffic. This is the kind of scale of map that we're using. So the engagement which we just ran through took place in the top left corner of this map. But an actual full-size game would take place over a much wider scope of territory. And that's where maneuver and tactics actually come in. And it's not just a slugfest with ships rocking up to each other and exchanging missile salvos. So that's what we've mostly done so far. We have also started to develop an operational scale version of this game, where very much is the same, but the scale has expanded. So the hexes are now 40 miles across, not 10, and game turns are 8 hours, not 1 hour. So this means that, well, for one thing, weapon ranges and sensor ranges get scaled down quite significantly. But it means that we can cover a much larger area. So this game covers the entire Caribbean. Game turns lasting 8 hours mean that 3 turns is a day, and 2 of those turns are probably daylight and 1 turn is night. So diurnal cycles start to become a thing. Perhaps we can't do certain things at night, or perhaps we can, but the other navy can't. And a game can last up to a week of game time, which starts to bring in interesting other challenges. Sustainment becomes important. If your game is lasting game time of 6 hours, your ships probably don't have to refuel. If your ships are lasting a week, then resupply and refuel becomes really important. So you have to start bringing in auxiliaries and protecting them. Weather becomes a thing. The weather can change on a day-to-day basis. In this game, hurricanes were a thing. And so the players were trying to deliver an amphibious task force in hurricane season. And so they had to dodge hurricanes or accept damage by driving their ships through hurricanes. So just bringing that scale up completely changes the shape of the game. And we can do things in the game which on the tactical scale are just too big for us to worry about. The other thing we do, because I run a submarine design course, is we use a similar game for, well, sorry, it's probably fairer to say we use a compatible game for submarine warfare, because we'll use the systems that we were just talking about if the submarine is going to shoot at a ship. But how submarines operate is so completely different that quite a lot of the submarine game is unrecognizable to someone who's only seen the above water game. Submarine warfare is very slow. It's absolutely vital that it's double blind, and sensors are much more complicated than just detecting things if you're in a certain range. Sonar performance is dependent on own ship speed, own ship activity, target speed, water conditions, and a whole bunch of other things. So this game is dominated by target detection and classification. So the sensor rules are much more involved, whereas the weapon engagement rules are much simpler. Because if you have a good firing solution on a target and it doesn't know you're there, you're very likely to just hit it with a torpedo. So the focus is completely different. Whereas above water is focused very much on details of layout, which doesn't really matter to submarines, and the interaction of defensive hard kill systems with air flight weapons, which again doesn't really matter to submarines. And instead, the submarine game is much more focused on sonar performance and how sonar performance varies with what you do with the boat. So that's where we are. That's ABF in its current form. It's changing relatively rapidly at the moment, and I'm finally I think at the point where we can codify it and actually write it down in a way which usefully can be given to people. I'm very keen to see other academic institutions or users use it. There are some areas which are still not finished because they don't tend to come up very much in games. Gunnery, surface gunnery, is something which most warships are capable of these days, but don't do very often. We have discovered, though, in quite a number of games, what has happened is two task forces will trade missile salvos, and they'll shoot down most of the enemy missile salvo. Maybe they'll take one or two hits in the task force, and then you'll have some intact ships on both sides which don't have any offensive anti-ship missiles left, at which point they need to close for a gunnery duel. Gunnery has a very different shape than missile combat. Most ships don't carry enough ammunition to keep firing for a very long time. And ships will enter range and will be maneuvering meaningfully over the course of a gunnery duel. So a ship has perhaps a few minutes, maybe 10 minutes worth of ammunition for its gun, and then it's out. But it will take more than 10 minutes to close from extreme range to point blank range, and the probability of hit will change dramatically from extreme range to point blank range. So gunnery, we have a model, we have the OA model built now for gunnery, and it's just in the process of having the wargame rules created around that OA model in a way which is elegant enough to be usable. I don't make any claim that this game is at all elegant. This game is it's the kind of horrible, crunchy thing which I hate when I see in a commercial game designed for fun. I acknowledge that it's inelegant and very crunchy, but for this use case, that was a deliberate choice. But for turning that OA model into an at all usable gunnery rule set is something which will require some work, and it appears to largely be a game of chicken. The question is, how late dare you hold your fire until you get in close? Because the longer you hold it, the more chance you have of scoring meaningful hits, but the more chances you give your enemy to hit you on the way in and maybe knock your systems out. The ASW model is having some work done because at the moment we have a working submarine game and a working above water game, but actually the interface between the two needs to be better. We've had some very simple rules in the past for amphibious landings because amphibious landings are they're a great centerpiece for a tactical or operational scale game, but we only have very, very simple rules for how they actually proceed and ground combat. And finally, weather. Weather is incredibly important. Weather, crew morale, and op defs, whether your equipment is working properly, are absolutely decisive, as we saw with the Moskva, and we just don't model that in the game yet. So those will be forthcoming. Well, that brings me to the end of my talk. We still have plenty of time if people have questions. Thank you for listening. That's a really good one. Yes, thank you for asking that. So I didn't really mention it in detail, but we almost always include substantial merchant traffic in a tactical game. Usually I will have a blue cell, which is usually students controlling ships they've designed themselves. We'll have a red cell, which might be students or might be research staff. And then we will have a white cell, which traditionally has been the PhD students from the research office who will control all of the merchant traffic in an area. There's usually about twice as much merchant traffic as there is naval traffic, or depending on the environment. And working out whether a ship is neutral or hostile is a huge deal. If you pick stuff up on radar, you know it's a ship. And if you know it's going very fast, it's probably a warship. But in lots of cases, you need to get an aircraft over there to actually look at it and establish that it's a warship. Or you run the risk of putting an anti-ship missile into a tanker. Several of our games have ended with tragic accidents or incidents as players have taken too much of a risk and they've wound up sinking neutral traffic, which has typically, for their briefings, been game over. Unfortunately, you've lost. So yeah, huge deal, because it's a huge deal in most modern naval warfare. So, yeah, this is something which I'm very interested in doing. The sustainment part of the operational level game is really interesting because we have students who design forward repair ships and naval auxiliaries, and ammunition, as we have said all the time, is so important to modern warships. So being able to replenish ammunition from ships that you have to protect, having ships that can refuel you, but you need to protect, is such an important part of modern naval warfare that I would be very, very keen to support it in the game. I just haven't figured out exactly how to do that yet, but that is on the list. I think the biggest challenge was that it didn't exist. There didn't seem to be a war game which reflected the impact of the decisions which I care about. The other challenge is that I have an audience of people who don't necessarily want to play war games. So they are not hobby gamers, and most of them aren't professional. They're not the kind of people who have gone into an OA field or professional wargaming. They're not people who are here because they're in a club and they love playing war games. So these are students I've got here because they want to do a master's in naval architecture. So I need to engage them. I need to make them, ideally, I would need to make them want to play this. If nothing else, I need to make them not just bounce off it. And so I've spent quite a lot of time in trying to establish how we can make the process, I would say, engaging rather than necessarily enjoyable. Enjoyment will lead to engagement, but there's a whole bunch of things we can do. Cheap tricks to create emotional states, investment in the ships. The fact that they've designed a ship means they're already quite invested in it. They've spent 3 months working on this project. Putting that ship into a war game is a really easy way to get students to care about the outcome of the game. Obviously, that's something I can only do later in the process than at the beginning. But yeah, engagement is probably the biggest single remaining challenge. Have we tried to enumerate the underlying assumptions we've used, for example, regarding damage control? Absolutely. So this is the purpose of that 3-layer structure. So we have the war game, and that sits on OA models, and then that sits on the database. So the OA models are where this comes in. Some of them are, some of those models are complex. Some of them are spreadsheets, or they're Python code, or some other model. Some of them are analysis that students do during the ship design. So each of these ships has an awful lot of science has been done onto that ship to generate the wargame stats, because a lot of those stats come from numbers that are in the student's report. So they've done a stability analysis. So I can look at the carpet plots and their stability analysis, and I can work out what the flooding tolerance is. That represents about a week's work by an MSc student. But because they had to do it for the course anyway, I can just scoop that in very easily. For things like damage control, we tend to draw on a combination of doctrine, on personal experience of staff members, and where possible, getting advice from SMEs. So things that we don't have physics-based models for, we will tend to draw on expert judgment where we can. And I'm fortunate that in this department, we happen to have a number of acoustics and warship vulnerability specialists who've spent time doing research into those areas. So I can draw upon their expertise for things like creating unclassified models of damage extent. Yes, I completely do. So yeah, the first couple of years of the game, we didn't have submarine rules, but you can absolutely replicate the effect on the decision state of a commander by telling them that there's a submarine present when there isn't one, because the main effect of submarines is they shape the operation. if you think there might be an enemy SSK in the area, then it's very dangerous to stop. It's very dangerous to go into choke points, and you need to allocate some portion of your forces to sanitizing areas and screening you. So if you've got a carrier group, you need to allocate some portion of your helicopters to do ASW patrol, which means they're not available for other things. You need to have some of your frigates doing sprint and drift towed array operations. And there doesn't actually need to be a submarine present in order to make that happen. So I have absolutely told players that, or in the intelligence briefing they receive at the start of the game, which I am clear is not always going to be completely accurate, we've often included suggestions that there may be a submarine in the area. In more recent years, when we actually have rules for submarines, we have now sometimes included a submarine in the area, just to keep things honest. But you're right, this is the most important way of getting people to do ASW-like operations is just make them suspect there's a submarine there. I mean, pay for my plane tickets and I'm very persuadable. So that's an interesting question. The maximum number that we've run on a side is probably about 10. That was in a scale of game where we had we ran from basically midday until the evening, so probably about an 8-hour game, and that's constrained largely by I don't want to bore students because we have the engagement issue that they're not frothing keen wargamers, and I can't really make them do. I can't really make them engage because this is not an examined part of the course. So 8 to 10 ships per side, but that was in a game with three different sides. So we perhaps had 25 to 30 ships on the board. You could do more. The operational game, we're looking at doing task forces. But the operational level game has some things in it which streamline procedures quite a lot. So generally speaking, task forces are going to be moving together as a task force. And engagements will be probably one task force and or air against a single task force. So by streamlining things a bit, we ought to be able to increase the number. It's just a case that it increases playtime. The real problem actually is number of submarines on a side, because the submarine detection model is something that it snowballs really rapidly. If you've got one I'm going to run a game tomorrow using the submarines model, and I expect to have one submarine on each side. We might have one submarine and a couple of ships on one side versus one submarine on the other. We ran a game last year. I say ran a game. We ran about one turn of a game last year for submarine design students, where we pitted 2 submarines against 2 submarines, and of those submarines, because they were student designs, one of them had a load of large uncrewed underwater vehicles, which they deployed into a sensor net, and one of them had a large number of uncrewed air vehicles, which they deployed into a sensor net, and suddenly we went from having 4 units on the board to having about 20. The detection model is an n-squared problem. So if you double the number of units, you quadruple the number of detections that you have to resolve, and the game just absolutely ground to a halt. So submarines is a much bigger problem for maximum numbers than for ships. Oh, thank you very much. I'm not sure that's a question, but I'm very happy to receive that as a comment. Perhaps. This isn't really a problem I have because I'm not dealing with professional wargamers. I'm dealing with student ship designers. But it has not. It varies. Sometimes I have a class who just don't really care and don't really want to engage. But sometimes, often, I get classes who are interested, and as long as you can keep things reasonably engaging, are willing to step out of their comfort zone and try stuff. Particularly because I think it's easy enough for us to, as long as we keep everything obviously relevant to what they're doing, they can see the benefit. Running a war game where they're employing frigates trying to stop an aircraft carrier battle group. Well, when they know that in 6 months, half of them are going to be designing frigates and one of them is going to be designing an aircraft carrier, it's very easy for them to see how this is a useful thing for them to be learning more about. If I was trying to get them to play Age of Sail games, I think it would be it would be harder because they and I would both know that this wasn't really anything more than an entertainment. Oh, that's a good one. So carriers. We've had students. So students will often design surface combatants. We'll usually have a spread in a year wherein 6 to 8 design teams. We might see 2 to 3 surface combatants, depending on what the students are interested in. We'll often see 1 or 2 naval auxiliaries that kind of blur the line between civilian and naval. We'll often see 1 or 2 civilian ships. Previously, we've had full-on aircraft carriers. We've had amphibious assault ships. We've had very large civilian ships. So we had a hydrogen tanker previously, which we included in a game, and it blew up exactly as you might imagine it would. Yeah, so it varies. I mean, those assault ships and aircraft carriers can be very large. Oh gosh, I'm not sure I'm in a position to throw around much wisdom, but I think the number one thing is make games. Don't feel like the process is learn to make games and then start making games. You learn by making. So make games, test them, get other people to play them, and they won't be very good. My games, in many ways, are not very good. This is not a fun game that you've just seen. But by making games and by playing them and playing other people's games, that's how you get better. And that's how you learn how things work in play. And that's how you in playing other people's games, that's how you learn what other ways exist to solve problems. And by amalgamating all of this knowledge and getting the experience of making games and seeing what works and what doesn't, I think that's how you become better. And I don't think that I'm saying that from the position of someone who has done it. I think I'm saying that very much from the position of someone who is on that road. And I can see improvement in myself, but I can also see how I have a long way to go. All right. Well, thank you very much. If anyone has any last burning questions to ask, this is your moment. Otherwise, I will hand back to Chris as the producer. Thank you very much. I believe you're muted.
Okay, so I went ahead and checked the box. There's at least once per connections I have to come on and start talking with my mic muted. Thank you very much. That was a great talk to kick off the Connections Online Showcase, and thank you very much for doing it.
Thanks for having me.
All right. Talk to you later, everybody.